Imagine watching an army cross a raging river at night, charging straight into an enemy that believed itself untouchable. Imagine hearing, in the dark, the muffled clash of armor against the current, fear masked by shouted orders in multiple tongues. This isn't a scene from a movie. This happened, and it was only the beginning. Do you know what's most dangerous in war? The swords, the numbers, or certainty? Because that's exactly what Alexander destroyed, the Persian certainty that they were invincible. Alexander's victories in Persia weren't just military. They were attacks on the empire's very logic. He didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rule book. He slashed through traditions with the blade of unpredictability. He turned symbols against themselves. He disarmed fortresses not with force, but with doubt. Sun Tzu once said, "All war is based on deception." Alexander took that to a whole new level. This wasn't about moving troops, it was about moving minds. And Persia, bigger and richer, never understood what was truly at stake until it was too late. Most empires don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they misread retreat as fear. The war against Persia wasn't a string of battles. It was the careful dismantling of an imperial mindset. Alexander didn't fight Persian strength, he fought their patterns. He made the impossible look logical, and the logical look naive. Crossing rivers under fire, cutting through myths with a single stroke, besieging cities that trusted geography too much. Each move was a mental incision, cold, surgical. And here's the question. If you were there, would you have seen it coming? Let's be clear. The Persians had the terrain, the numbers, the wealth. They owned the trade routes, dominated the mountains, and ruled through a deeply entrenched political elite. On paper, they were unbeatable. But that paper never accounted for a young king who saw logic as an obstacle. Alexander turned every Persian strength into a trap. Their numbers became sluggishness. Their geography turned into blind spots, their confidence into arrogance, and that's when it all started to crumble. It wasn't logistics that collapsed, it was psychology. Persian arrogance broke first, morale followed, then the empire itself. This documentary isn't about a military campaign, it's about surgery. 5 moves. 5 tactical blades, each one used at the exact pressure point of the enemy. These weren't just military maneuvers, they were psychological wounds, surgical strikes that bled out ideas, not just men. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why, even 2 millennia later, no general has ever repeated what Alexander achieved. But be warned, what you're about to see may change the way you think about war, about strategy, and maybe even leadership itself. It was late spring, 334 years before Christ. The waters of the Granicus River glistened like silver blades under the Anatolian sun. A deceptive calm hovered above the surface. But on the western bank, Alexander's army stood motionless, not frozen by fear, but by choice. A choice that would unsettle the very foundation of Persian military confidence. To the Persians waiting on the opposite shore, it must have seemed foolish. Why would any sane commander attempt a frontal assault across a river, against fortified cavalry and a superior position? It defied logic, terrain, and precedent. Memnon of Rhodes, the Greek mercenary commander in Persian service, warned them. "Don't fight on his terms," he said. "Draw him in, starve him out." But Darius wasn't present. In his place stood satraps of the western Persian provinces, driven by pride and poisoned by a familiar mistake, underestimating the mind behind the Macedonian armor. What the Persians didn't understand, what most commanders even today fail to grasp, was that Alexander's strength wasn't just in steel or numbers. It was in rhythm, in knowing when to break it. He didn't attack the river because it was a good idea. He attacked because they believed he never would. The terrain was unforgiving. The Granicus wasn't a wide river, but its steep banks and rocky bed made cavalry deployment almost suicidal. And yet that was the bait. Alexander wanted the Persians focused there, glued to the logic of defense. What they couldn't see was the deception wrapped inside the madness. Before dawn, scouts reported that the Persians had formed a strong front along the eastern bank. Heavy cavalry at the center, Greek mercenaries on the flanks, archers poised for ambush. They were anchored on a ridge that overlooked the river, a textbook advantage, but it became a trap of their own making. Alexander feigned hesitation. He allowed his generals to discuss alternatives. He walked the riverbank as if doubting his own judgment. All of it was theater, a misdirection not to the enemy's eyes, but to their expectations. Then came the signal. At midday, the Macedonian cavalry began moving, slow, deliberate, noisy, but not toward the crossing. Instead, they veered upstream, drawing Persian eyes with them. And just when the Persians began to reposition, Alexander struck elsewhere. Leading a wedge of companion cavalry, he hurled himself into the Granicus, water up to his chest, spear high. Not at the flanks, not at the archers, right at the center, where they least expected. One chronicler, Arrian, writing centuries later, captured the brutality of that moment. The river became a battleground of hooves and blood. Horses slipped, men drowned, steel found flesh beneath the waves. The impact was immediate. Persian lines bent, then fractured. Their cavalry, superior in numbers, had been drawn too far forward too early. The riverbank, once an advantage, now funneled them into a kill zone. Macedonian infantry surged behind the cavalry in tight formations, like a second blade behind the first. But perhaps the most devastating blow was not tactical, it was psychological. When Memnon's men realized Alexander himself had led the charge, a ripple of fear cracked the command chain. Their assumptions of safety, of superiority, of strategy were shattered in a single moment of impossible audacity. This wasn't just a win, it was a message. The young king had rewritten the rules of engagement in blood and river mud. And what of Darius? He wasn't there. He had trusted the local satraps, expected a delay, a siege, a negotiation. Instead, he awoke days later to news that his western defenses had collapsed. The illusion of security, gone. The myth of Macedonian inferiority, gone. Alexander didn't just cross the Granicus, he invaded their certainty. And what came next would haunt the empire forever. What if every move Alexander made was part of a deeper, hidden logic? From the riverbanks of Granicus to the mind of his enemies, what would you have done in his place? Drop your answer in the comments. Would you have crossed the river or waited like the Persians expected? And if you've made it this far, there's a storm of strategy still ahead. Don't just watch, engage. This is where minds sharpen. The sun hung high over Gordium, casting long shadows across a city frozen between myth and fate. Dust clung to every surface, temples, markets, blades. And in the heart of the citadel, beneath the cracked stone of an ancient altar, it waited. The knot. Not just a tangle of rope, but a symbol carved into prophecy. For centuries, the Phrygians believed this chariot, bound by an impossible knot, held the future of empire. He who unraveled it, they said, would conquer all of Asia. But how do you cut through centuries of belief? How do you break a prophecy without starting a war of gods? Alexander didn't come to untie a rope, he came to break a story. It was late 334, just weeks after the blood-soaked crossing of the Granicus. His army had moved inland, deeper into Asia Minor. Supplies were tight, loyalties looser. Local satraps, like Mithrames, recently captured, had begun to see which way the wind was blowing. Alexander needed more than victories. He needed symbols. That's when he rode into Gordium. Arrian tells us he examined the knot carefully, fingers tracing weathered cord and bark. No ends, no pattern. Just tension, friction, permanence. Priests watched in silence. Soldiers whispered. Even the veterans, bloodied and brutal, stood still. Then, without warning, he drew his sword. It wasn't anger, it wasn't haste, it was clarity. In one strike, he split the knot in two, cutting not just the rope, but the myth that bound it. To some, it seemed reckless. To others, genius. But the effect? Immediate. That night, around fires and in wine-soaked whispers, the army changed. Soldiers didn't just believe they would take Persia. They believed they were meant to. The line between prophecy and reality blurred, and Alexander walked straight through it. The geopolitical tremor was just beginning. Word reached Babylon within days, then Persepolis. Darius heard it not as a tactical update, but as a challenge. A Macedonian had desecrated a sacred object of Asia. It wasn't just war now, it was personal. But if Darius thought this was a juvenile provocation, he misunderstood the message. Alexander wasn't defying tradition, he was reprogramming it. He didn't move armies through terrain, he moved meaning through culture. The strike at Gordium wasn't unsoldierly, it was surgical. Because by severing that knot, Alexander collapsed the illusion of Persian divine protection. It was no longer a war between peoples, it was a war between fates. Parmenion, the old general who had stood by Philip's side, reportedly scoffed that night. If the gods wanted him to untie it, he should have used his brain, not his blade. But even Parmenion couldn't deny what came after. A surge in loyalty, a quiet fervor, men marching not just for land, but for destiny. The tactic here wasn't about swords or spears, it was about narrative control. By framing the act as divine permission rather than sacrilege, Alexander flipped the spiritual script. Even Napoleon, 2,000 years later, would echo this truth. The moral is to the physical as 3 to 1. And one of Alexander's men, a foot soldier named Malaris, left a scribbled note on a clay shard near the temple. "The gods have chosen our king. I saw it today. He touched time with iron." Micro moments like that, the kind archaeologists still find buried under layers of wind and silence, tell us more than any scroll. They speak of belief systems collapsing, of men transformed. The Gordian knot was never about solving a puzzle. It was about redefining power. And Alexander, he didn't wait for history to judge him. He rewrote it with a single, deliberate stroke. The wind of the Carian coast carried more than salt that autumn of 334 before Christ. It carried fire and dread. Halicarnassus wasn't just another coastal stronghold. It was Persia's linchpin in southwestern Asia Minor, a walled jewel built on cliffs and stone, guarded by ramparts that had held off countless assaults. But more than that, it was commanded by one of the most cunning minds of the age, Memnon of Rhodes. He had failed to stop Alexander at the Granicus. He had warned Darius, had argued for patience and for asymmetric warfare. Now, he was determined to prove that brains could still outlast boldness. Alexander arrived late in the campaign season, his forces stretched and the sea growing unpredictable. Most commanders would have bypassed the fortress, avoided a long engagement. But that's precisely what Memnon expected. Instead, Alexander besieged it. Why? Because Halicarnassus wasn't just a tactical prize. It was Persia's linchpin in southwestern Asia Minor, a walled jewel built on cliffs and stone, guarded by ramparts that had held off countless assaults. But more than that, it was commanded by one of the most cunning minds of the age, Memnon of Rhodes. He had failed to stop Alexander at the Granicus. He had warned Darius, had argued for patience and for asymmetric warfare. Now he was determined to prove that brains could still outlast boldness. Alexander arrived late in the campaign season, his forces stretched, and the sea growing unpredictable. Most commanders would have bypassed the fortress, avoided a long engagement. But that's precisely what Memnon expected. Instead, Alexander besieged it. Why? Because Halicarnassus wasn't a tactical prize, it was a psychological wall, a symbol. If it remained standing, it told every satrap in the Aegean coast that resistance could work, that Macedon had limits. The siege wasn't about winning fast, it was about burning slow. The first assaults were pro-build strikes, testing towers, triggering counterattacks, but they weren't meant to break through, they were meant to wear down. Each night, Alexander's engineers advanced siege mounds, giant earthworks slowly inching toward the city. They dragged towers covered in wet hides to deflect fire. They launched flaming projectiles that turned the sky into a rain of stars. But then they'd stop, go silent. Memnon never knew when the next strike would come. That uncertainty, that silence, was the real weapon. A soldier named Kairos, who fought near the eastern breach, later described the sensation in a recovered tablet fragment. It wasn't the fighting that broke us, it was waiting for it. Alexander's tactics turned the city into a pressure cooker. No single blow would destroy it, but the constant threat, the psychological exhaustion, the dissonance, that would. He cut water lines, only to let them be repaired. He spread false rumors through prisoners. He dropped forged letters over the walls, suggesting betrayal among Memnon's lieutenants. The city began to sweat not from heat, but from doubt. The geography amplified it all. Halicarnassus sat atop steep cliffs. defensible yet isolated. Its harbor, once a lifeline for Persian ships, was now blockaded. Supplies trickled in slower, morale trickled out faster. Memnon, to his credit, didn't flinch. He counterattacked fiercely, even launching night raids that torched some of Alexander's siege engines. But each action cost more than it gained. Every sortie left fewer men, fewer options. And Alexander, he never responded with outrage. He let it happen, because even when Memnon struck back, he was still playing the game Alexander had chosen. Classical historian Diodorus recorded how a turning point came not from steel, but from smoke. One night, Persian defenders set fire to their own outer wall, abandoning it to retreat inward. The Macedonians watched flames rise where they had once failed to breach, not with joy, with recognition. The city wasn't fighting anymore. It was collapsing in on itself. The final assault didn't look like victory. It looked like aftermath. Buildings charred, streets empty, defenders exhausted beyond logic, retreating to the citadel before fleeing by sea. Alexander walked the ruins, not as a conqueror drunk on blood, but as a surgeon checking for signs of decay. He hadn't just taken a city, he'd exhausted its will. The lesson was clear. Sometimes you don't need to break the walls, you only need to break the people behind them. It's here we see a different side of warfare, one often overlooked. Not the clash of spears or cavalry charges, but the war of nerve versus noise, where patience becomes a blade, and silence the hammer that crushes hope.
There are cities that resist armies, and then there are cities that dare history to try. Tyre, in the spring of 332 before Christ, was just that. A fortress of stone and salt, it sat nearly a kilometer offshore. An island wrapped in two harbors, thick walls, and centuries of defiance. Phoenician pride beat strong in its heart. The Persians still held the sea. And Alexander? He had no navy. To most commanders, that would have been enough. Tyre had withstood the Assyrians for 5 years, the Babylonians for 13. And now it stared down a young Macedonian king who couldn't even reach its walls. But that was the mistake. Because Alexander wasn't looking to breach Tyre's defenses, he was looking to erase its immunity. The siege began not with a battle cry, but with a decision. He would build a causeway from the mainland to the island, across open sea against waves, wind, and arrows. At first, even his own men hesitated. Parmenion questioned the logic. Others feared the cost. But Alexander's mind didn't calculate feasibility the way others did. He didn't see sea. He saw an equation of resistance and time. So the work began. Trees were felled from nearby forests, stones pulled from ancient ruins. Thousands of hands, soldiers, engineers, slaves, dragged them into the surf. Day by day, the mold crept forward. And Tyre? It laughed. From atop its towers, archers mocked the labor. Ships darted in to destroy early sections. Divers cut supports under moonlight. For weeks, the construction felt like trying to choke a whale with twine. But something shifted as the mole neared deeper water. The Tyrians' jokes became volleys, then flames. They launched fire ships, vessels packed with tar and brush into the structure, igniting everything. For a moment, it seemed the sea had taken its revenge. The mole burned. But it didn't end. Alexander rebuilt it, wider, stronger, And this time, he called in fleets from Sidon and Herodotus, coastal cities recently subdued. With these reinforcements, Macedon had a navy. Tyre was no longer a sea fortress. It was a trap, an island slowly being surrounded by dry land and steel. The days turned to months. Supply lines inside Tyre tightened, morale thinned. Still, they refused to surrender. One of Alexander's soldiers, a young engineer named Philotas, reportedly collapsed after working the siege towers. His letter, discovered centuries later on a lead scroll, read, "We are building a road through the ocean to shame a city." That shame came in July. With the mole complete and towers towering above the walls, Alexander ordered the final assault. Battering rams slammed the seawall. Naval units coordinated from both harbors. Archers rained death from movable towers. When a breach opened near the southern wall, Macedonian elite units surged through. What followed wasn't battle, it was collapse. The Tyrians fought house by house, rooftop by rooftop, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of hope. Civilians fled to temples. Soldiers fell in courtyards. Blood mixed with seawater. By sunset, the city that had defied empires for centuries burned. Alexander spared few. His fury was cold, precise. Tyre hadn't just resisted, it had humiliated him. And now it was a warning. Diodorus claims over 6,000 defenders were killed, some 2,000 crucified along the shore. A wall of bodies where once there had been laughter. The siege of Tyre didn't just test engineering, it tested resolve. For Alexander, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was a canvas for domination. It's November, 333 before Christ. The air along the Panaris River is heavy, not with rain, but with tension. The soil is thick with mud, a treacherous mix of rainwater and blood waiting to be spilled. Somewhere behind the hills of Cilicia, the sea roars faintly. And in the narrow plain between the mountains and the river, history sharpens its blade. This is Issus, a place where geography betrayed its master. Darius III, King of Kings, finally steps into the field. Until now, he had delegated, hesitated, watched from afar. But the fall of Sardis, the humiliation of Tyre, the shadow cast by a Macedonian rising star, it forced his hand. And yet, look at the map. Issus should never have been the chosen ground. Persia had numbers, over 100,000 men by some accounts, including cavalry, Greek mercenaries, archers, and the immortals, elite royal guards. But Issus was a bottleneck, a killing corridor between sea and hills. That terrain, that choke, it neutralized everything that made Persian warfare effective. Why would Darius make that move? According to Arrian and Curtius Rufus, it wasn't strategy, it was ego. Darius had learned that Alexander was behind him, having crossed the Amanus Mountains. He didn't wait. He turned his army around to intercept, to trap him. But in doing so, he trapped himself. Alexander's force was vastly outnumbered, roughly 40,000 with Macedonian phalanxes, companion cavalry, and lightly armored skirmishers. But here, the numbers didn't matter. The narrow valley compressed the Persian army. Cavalry couldn't maneuver. Archers couldn't spread. The great wings of Darius's formation folded inward on themselves. It began with the rain. That morning, as both armies stared across the field, a drizzle fell, just enough to slick the earth and dull the metal.
Macedonian soldiers tightened leather straps. Some whispered prayers. A man named Theodectes, a shield-bearer from Pella, later described the moment in a scratched bronze medallion found near the riverbank, quote, "We could smell their breath before we saw their charge. That's how close they'd pushed. That's how badly they wanted us broken." And yet, Alexander did not wait. He launched the right flank forward, his own companion cavalry toward the Persian left. But it wasn't just an attack. It was a feint wrapped in intent. The true target wasn't the Persian line. It was Darius himself. Alexander charged, not across the field randomly, but at an angle, an oblique push toward the center, where Darius sat high on his royal chariot, surrounded by his guards. The signal was clear. He wasn't just attacking an army. He was challenging an empire's face. The effect was seismic. Darius, seeing the charge, panicked. For the second time in a generation, the great king of Persia fled the field. Horses trampled, banners fell, order collapsed. Rain turned the earth into a graveyard of indecision. Persian units crumpled from the center outward. Those pinned the narrow rear had nowhere to go. The river they'd crossed to meet Alexander now became their tomb. Macedonian phalanxes, steady and relentless, moved forward like a jaw closing on its prey. Every inch was taken with spears, shields, and screams. One story from Plutarch tells of a Persian officer named Bugoas, who leapt from his chariot into the mud to avoid capture, only to be struck by his own retreating comrades. A symbol of what the battle had become. Disorder, eating itself. Issus wasn't a contest of tactics. It was a decapitation of confidence. And in the aftermath, Alexander stood over what had once been Darius's royal tent. He found treasure, robes, even the king's family, wife, mother, daughters, abandoned in the panic. But he touched none of them with violence, not out of mercy, but to send a message. I do not war against women, but against the man who fled. That day, Persia lost more than soldiers. It lost belief. The kind of belief that holds an empire together when everything else is falling apart.
Dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela with an eerie stillness. The dust hadn't risen yet, the weapons hadn't sung, but the silence, it was already deafening. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the full breadth of Darius III's final stand stretched like a wave frozen in time. It was October, 331 before Christ, and what lay ahead wasn't just a battlefield, it was a theater of overconfidence. Gaugamela, meaning the camel's house, was no random place. Darius chose it deliberately. He ordered the plain flattened, cleared of rocks and ridges, so that his cavalry and chariots could operate at full momentum. He wanted no terrain surprises, no bottlenecks like Issus. This was to be his redemption, his overwhelming revenge. And on paper, it made sense. Darius assembled over 200,000 men, perhaps more according to sources like Arrian and Diodorus. Cavalry lined his flanks, with scythed chariots poised at the center, their blades designed to shred infantry ranks. War elephants, rarely used in Persian fields, stood ready. Macedonian scouts estimated the army stretched across nearly 5 kilometers. And yet, Alexander wasn't intimidated. Why? Because he saw the difference between volume and vision. His force numbered around 47,000. outnumbered nearly 5-1, but every man was positioned with purpose. Macedonian phalanxes formed a bristling wall at the center, each sarissa, a long spear angled slightly forward like the teeth of a war animal. Cavalry was concentrated on the right under his direct command. On the left, Parmenion guarded the flank with infantry and Thessalian horsemen. But the brilliance? It lay in how Alexander would use space and tempo. Just before the clash, one of Alexander's scouts, a Thracian named Orestes, wrote a message on papyrus later found in a ruined outpost near Arbela. "We are not in a fight. We are in a lesson." It began with movement. Rather than charge, Alexander began shifting his formation diagonally to the right. Slowly, deliberately. He wasn't retreating. He was pulling Darius's cavalry out of position, dragging the Persian left farther and farther until a gap emerged in their center. That's when the oblique formation revealed its genius. Instead of attacking head-on, Alexander waited. And when Darius blinked, committing his side to chariots to a frontal charge, Alexander's men parted like a gate. The chariots passed through and were cut down from the flanks. The field, once smooth, now betrayed the Persians. Dust, chaos, screams, no formation held. That gap in the center, it opened just long enough. Alexander surged. With companion cavalry at his side, he pierced the Persian center, not randomly, but precisely where Darius stood. The shock wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. For the second time in as many years, Darius saw the enemy's king not as a distant threat, but riding toward him, sword drawn, eyes locked, and once again the King of Kings fled. What followed wasn't pursuit, it was unraveling. The Persian line, spread too wide, stretched too thin, collapsed from the core. Parmenion on left held firm, barely, but the real victory had already happened. Darius's standard was gone, the image of imperial power shattered. Some Persian commanders like satrap Mazaeus tried to regroup, but even they saw it. This wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a mirror, reflecting back every weakness they'd refused to confront. By nightfall, over 40,000 Persians lay dead or scattered. Alexander's losses were minimal by comparison, and the road to Babylon wide open. The victory at Gaugamela wasn't just the defeat of an army. It was the confirmation of empire and the destruction of the idea that Persia was invincible. And in the middle of it all stood Alexander, not covered in glory, but in dust, blood, and something far colder, intent. 2 battles, 2 charges, 2 times Darius fled. But what if you were the Persian king? Faced with a charge like that, would you hold your ground or run to fight another day? Tell us below, do you think Darius ever had a chance? Or was Alexander already fighting inside his head? And if this clash has shaken your idea of ancient warfare, buckle up. The war is far from over. The most controversial decision is still to come. It wasn't the sound of war that echoed in Persepolis. It was something far older. The creak of ancient cedar beams, the dry rustle of silk tapestries stirred by desert wind, and beneath it all, a silence that didn't belong to conquest, but to consequence. It was early 330 before Christ when Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, a city not built for defense or trade, but for ritual, awe, and permanence. Its columns reached into the sky like frozen prayers. Carvings along its stone staircases showed tribute bearers from across the empire, Ethiopians, Indians, Medes, bending the knee to a king who now ran from battlefield to battlefield. But Darius was gone, fled east after Gaugamela. What remained was the shell of power.
Alexander camped his army just outside the gates, knowing full well what lay inside. Persia's sacred throne room, the Apadana, the Hall of 100 Columns, the treasury, some 200,000 talents of gold and silver, a fortune in metal, but even more in symbolism. He didn't need to storm it. The city opened its gates. Some say it was mercy that stayed his hand. Others say he was still calculating. The Macedonians were now deep into foreign soil. Morale was brittle. Discipline thinner than it had ever been. One of Alexander's officers, a veteran named Polystratus, later wrote in a personal account, "We had marched so far from home, we no longer smelled like Macedonians." That night, a banquet was held. There was music, wine, dancers, and the kind of laughter that only follows too many funerals. And then, the decision. According to Plutarch, it began as a suggestion, perhaps by Thais, a companion from Athens, who had seen her own city burned by Xerxes decades before. Let the torch that fell on Athens fall now on the palace of Persia, she may have said. Whether it was vengeance, intoxication, or a calculated signal, Alexander agreed. The flames began at the palace of Xerxes. Not a military outpost, not a supply depot, but the core of Persian identity. Fire climbed the walls with unnatural speed. Drapes turned to ash, gold ornaments cracked, and the ceiling, hundreds of years old, groaned before falling like a dying colossus. Soldiers stood at a distance, some cheering, others stunned. A few wept, because they weren't watching a city fall. They were watching an era end. Persepolis wasn't a target of opportunity. It was a message. To every satrap still holding out, to every noble still doubting Alexander's legitimacy, and perhaps to himself. The geography of Persepolis made the fire even more symbolic. Built on a terraced plateau at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, its elevation gave it a throne-like presence over the region. Destroying it didn't just erase a capital, it burned the sky above an empire. But in that fire was contradiction. Why destroy what you already control? Why erase what you could claim? Because Alexander understood the psychology of power. To rule Asia, he didn't just need Persian land, he needed Persian memory to collapse. This was more than strategy. It was ritual execution. Later, he would regret it, or at least say he did. The ruins of Persepolis remained behind him, like a scar he couldn't walk away from. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. And the empire saw. From the Ecbatana to Bactria, from satrap Ereborzanes to the scattered remnants of Darius's court, the message was clear. The old world was not returning. Only ash remained.
Spring in Susa wasn't like spring in Macedon. The air was thicker, perfumed with dates and frankincense. The heat arrived early and lingered like a silent guest. The great halls of the Persian palace shimmered under sunlight that danced off polished stone and gold inlays. But this was not the return of empire. This was the reprogramming of it. It was 324 before Christ. Alexander had conquered the body of Persia. Now he wanted its soul. What do you do when your enemies are no longer on the battlefield, but living in your cities, dining at your tables, whispering in your court? You don't fight them, you marry them. And so Alexander orchestrated an event that defied the rhythm of war. No swords, no siege ladders. Instead, robes,
garlands, and oaths whispered in both Greek and Persian. Over 10,000 men, Macedonian officers, generals, veterans, stood in ceremonial lines in the palace of Darius, and beside them, daughters of Persian nobility, among them Barsine, daughter of Artabazus, Drypedes, and Statira, daughters of Darius himself. Alexander married Statira, not for love, but for permanence. This was genealogy as statecraft. According to Arrian and Curtius Rufus, each wedding was recorded, blessed by Persian priests and Greek officials alike. The fusion was not symbolic, it was engineered. But not everyone saw it as unity. Among the veterans, especially those who had marched since the beginning, whispers grew. "Are we becoming them?" asked a man named Cletos, a grizzled officer who had once saved Alexander at Granicus. He wrote in his field notes, later discovered near the Susa citadel, "Our sons will not know who to fight or why." That was the point. Alexander understood something most emperors missed. To rule forever, you don't need conquest, you need confusion. If your subjects can't tell who they are, if bloodlines mix, customs blur, names echo in two tongues, then rebellion becomes fragmented. Identity dissolves. You don't suppress cultures, you merge them, and to resistance has no voice. Susa wasn't just a royal wedding, it was a military maneuver in robes. From a geopolitical lens, the move silenced old satraps like Oxothrace and Maziches. It folded Persia inward. Nobles who might have plotted insurrection suddenly had Macedonian sons-in-law. Troops saw their commanders returning to barracks with Persian brides and new loyalties. Even administrative posts shifted. Persian scribes were placed alongside Greek commanders. Taxes were recalibrated and not conquered. Trade flowed across once divided borders with bilingual ledgers. But beneath this calm, something more unsettling stirred. The Macedonian elite, men who had bled for every inch of Asia, began to feel displaced, forgotten. There were murmurs of betrayal. Some veterans tore their wedding contracts. Others disappeared into the mountains, unwilling to serve in an empire they no longer recognized. Alexander's grip tightened, but so did the fractures within. He hadn't just conquered Persia, he had started a slow war inside his own ranks. And still the ceremony lingered in the memories of those present. Music echoing through marble halls, women veiled in silk, candles flickering over maps of old kingdoms now merged in matrimony. In that moment, Alexander wasn't just king, he was architect of lineage. And like all architects, he knew to build something that lasts, you don't just use stone, you use blood. There are places on earth not meant to be crossed, not by men, not by armies. The Gedrosian Desert, modern-day Makran, stretching across southern Iran and Pakistan, is one of them. By 325 before Christ, Alexander had nothing left to prove. Babylon was his. Persepolis had been burned. Darius was long dead. The Persian Empire lay shattered. And yet, instead of returning home by the secure northern route, he turned his gaze south, toward the heat, the sand, and the silence of Gedrosia. Why? Some say it was arrogance. Others say it was divine imitation, retracing the steps of Cyrus the Great, who had lost an army there centuries earlier. But to those who marched, it felt like something else entirely. Punishment. Not of an enemy, of themselves. After the mutiny in India, after months of refusal, fatigue, and the slow erosion of unity among his ranks, Alexander chose a path not through strategy, but through purging. The Gedrosian route was not marked by roads or rivers. It was wind-carved rock, salt-crusted ground, and dunes that moved like ghosts. No maps, no wells, just endurance. He split his forces. One part, under Admiral Granicus, sailed along the coast with the supply ships. The rest, tens of thousands, marched inland. It was a calculated risk, one rooted not in military necessity, but in psychological recalibration. Within days, the desert began to take. The sun was not the enemy. The thirst was. Water became ritual. Units moved by night, slept by day under makeshift awnings. Sandstorms erased direction. Horses dropped from heat. Camels bolted into the void. One soldier, a Thessalian named Demophon, recorded in his journal, later found near the ruins of Pura, that they drank their own sweat. Others slit the throats of animals just to lap the moisture from their stomachs. Rations meant to last weeks vanished in days. Still, Alexander walked on foot alongside his men, refused water when they couldn't drink. He was no longer a king here. He was a symbol of will. That wasn't leadership. That was ritual hardship. Historians like Arrian and Plutarch write of moments where entire regiments simply disappeared, swallowed by heat, by the absence of direction, by the decision to press forward when logic demanded retreat. But that's where we see the pattern. This wasn't madness. It was filtration. The Gedrosian march became a furnace, burning away hesitation, disloyalty, fragility. Those who survived didn't just follow Alexander. They belonged to him. Geopolitically, the maneuver made no sense. No enemy blocked the coast. No rebellion threatened the south. And yet, every satrap who watched from afar received one message: even the desert does not resist him. That's power not born of conquest, but myth-making. And yet, it came at a cost. Over 10,000 men are believed to have died, not from arrows, but from dehydration, exposure, madness. Some dropped their armor to walk lighter. Others dropped their names. By the time the army emerged near the coast, they were no longer soldiers. They were survivors of the unthinkable. And Alexander? He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked back once, at the dunes, at the pain, and then forward again. Because even after all he had taken, all he had burned and bent, there were still parts of himself he hadn't conquered. The Nile didn't roar like a battlefield. It whispered. It wound slowly through the sand, ancient and eternal, carrying not soldiers but grain, trade, myth. It was here, on the edge of river and sea, between delta winds and the salt of the Mediterranean, that Alexander made one of his quietest yet most devastatingly permanent moves. He founded a city. But Alexandria wasn't a reward. It was a weapon, disguised in marble. It was April of 331 before Christ. Alexander had just left the Oracle of Siwa, where priests had whispered that he was more than king, more than mortal, somewhere between deity and destiny. And while most of his army expected a return to conquest, what he laid down was a blueprint. At the western edge of the Nile Delta, near the village of Rakotis, he stood with architects and surveyors. No royal tent, no drumbeat of war, just a vision. A city that would outlive his battles, outlive even his bloodline. Why there? Because Alexandria was more than geography. It was geopolitical programming. The site allowed direct maritime access to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea via canals and river routes. It was a node in a growing empire's supply chain, a place where grain, soldiers, merchants, and messages could be dispatched like arrows. According to the chronicler Plutarch, Alexander himself sketched the city's layout in flour on the ground. Lines for roads, circles for towers, squares for temples. When birds came and ate the markings, priests called it an omen. He called it a signal. The city would be laid out in a grid, something rare in the ancient world. Straight avenues, central squares, docks, storage zones, and quarters for Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Persians. It was not a melting pot. It was architectural assimilation. He built Greek theaters beside Egyptian shrines, schools beside markets, temples for both Zeus and Isis. The walls didn't separate cultures. They forced them to coexist. And that was the genius. Armies win wars, but cities hold empires. Alexandria didn't just project control, it taught loyalty. Macedonian officers were offered estates nearby. Soldiers who had bled in Bactria or Tyre found themselves overseeing irrigation projects, not trenches. Families grew, roots spread, and suddenly what had been an army on the move became a civilization that stayed. One letter, found in a buried cache near the harbor district, was written by a veteran named Anakatos. He had marched from Pella to Persepolis. In it, he says, "Here, my daughter speaks Greek and prays like her mother. I no longer know which of us won the war." That's urban warfare, but of a different kind. Alexandria became the intellectual nerve center of the empire. The library, the lighthouse, the pharos. These weren't ornaments. They were bastions, monuments to permanence, fortresses of knowledge. And while Alexander moved east, chasing what remained of Persian resistance, the city stood like a seed planted in wet stone. Because cities don't die on the battlefield. They outlive generals. Conquest moves fast on open plains, but in the mountains, time slows. It stretches, warps, disorients. And for the first time in his campaign, Alexander found himself not in pursuit of a king, but in pursuit of a shadow. Bactria, northern Afghanistan today, a land of stone ridges and frozen passes, deep valleys that swallow sound and sunlight. Here, empires don't march. They bleed slowly. It was late 330 before Christ when Alexander entered Bactria. He expected defiance. What he didn't expect was disappearance. After defeating Darius and occupying the Persian heartland, Alexander had assumed the east would fold like the rest. But in Bactria, he discovered a war without rules. No front lines, no sieges, just ambushes, sabotage, vanishing enemies who knew every crevice of every ridge. The enemy was Spitamenes, a former ally of Darius and satrap of Sogdiana, charismatic, swift, and utterly unpredictable. He didn't gather armies, he gathered tribes, nomads, horse archers, raiders who fought not for empire, but for autonomy, for land passed from father to son. Alexander's phalanx, his legendary spear wall, was useless here. Tight formations shattered on uneven terrain. Cavalry charges lost momentum in mountain passes. The Macedonian supply line, stretched thin from Babylon to the edge of the Hindu Kush, became a target itself, and Spitamides struck precisely there. He didn't try to win territory, he tried to break trust. In the winter of 330 before Christ, Spitamides besieged the Macedonian-held city of Maracanda. Alexander wasn't nearby. He had left the city under the command of Granicus. The result? Catastrophic. Entire detachments were wiped out. Reinforcements were ambushed in the snow. The desert, once an enemy Alexander had chosen, had a pattern. But this war had no rhythm, no center, only erosion. He adapted, slowly. He split his forces into mobile units, built fortresses along the Oxus River, offered amnesty to some tribal leaders, brutalized others. It became a grind, a long, bitter attrition. In one recovered account, a soldier named Thrasilos wrote, "It is not war, it is sleep in armor. We wake each day wondering if we will still be in command of our own legs." Victory came eventually. Spitamides was betrayed by his own allies, delivered in chains. But by then, the cost was already tattooed across Alexander's army. They had come seeking empire. They had found resistance with no borders. What Alexander learned in Bactria wasn't just about warfare. It was about limits of force, of identity, of control. Cities could be burned, armies broken. But when an idea takes to the mountains, when it wears the face of a people who vanish when chased, it becomes something else. Something a phalanx can't pierce. It didn't happen on a battlefield. There were no banners, no horns, no formations. Just a banquet. A golden hall in Samarkand, 328 before Christ. Laughter, music, the clinking of wine cups. And then the silence that comes right before a man is killed by the one he once protected. Cletus the Black was no ordinary officer. He wasn't just a soldier in Alexander's army, he was a lifeline. At the Battle of Granicus, it was Cletus who had saved Alexander's life, cutting down a Persian noble who raised a scimitar above the young king's exposed neck. He was family, veteran, Macedonian to the bone, and he would die by Alexander's own hand. But how do empires crack? Not through defeat, through intoxication of power, of ego, of identity blurred beyond recognition. By the time the army reached Samarkand, Alexander had crossed the known world. He had taken Babylon, Persepolis, Susa, married into Persian royalty, adopted foreign dress, demanded the ritual of proskynesis, Persian-style homage that felt like worship. To many Macedonians, it was betrayal. And Cletus? He had seen it all, from Philip to the phalanx, from Pella to the Indus. And now, watching his king blur into a foreign god, he couldn't stay quiet. The banquet started like many others. Wine flowing, poets reciting, veterans boasting. But as the toasts turned sour, voices rose. Cletus mocked Alexander's Persian robes, called him ungrateful, reminded him in front of everyone that he owed his life to Macedonian blood, not divine destiny. And Alexander snapped. He leapt to his feet. Guards froze, wine spilled, someone tried to intervene, maybe Ptolemy, maybe Hephaestion, but it was too late. He grabbed a spear and thrust it through Cletus's chest. According to Arrian, the room went still. The king stood alone, staring at the body, the blood already soaking into the floor. The man who had saved him, now slain by him. What followed wasn't immediate regret. It was collapse. Alexander locked himself in his tent for days, refused food, refused counsel. Some say he tried to take his own life with the same spear. Others say he screamed until his throat bled. But none of that changed what had happened. Because this wasn't just the death of a man, it was the death of balance. Until then, Alexander had stood on the edge, between conquest and command, between strategy and soul. But with Cletus, the line broke. No enemy had done it, no satrap, no rebellion, just a king drunk on his own mythology, striking down the last man who dared to remind him he was mortal. And the army saw. They didn't revolt, but something shifted. The blind devotion cracked. The camaraderie thinned. Men began to whisper. Some hardened, others looked homeward. One soldier, Neleus of Amphipolis, scribbled a note onto a piece of leather found years later. We crossed deserts for him, but now we cross silence. The outside war was nearing an end, but inside that golden hall in Samarkand, a different war had begun. A war Alexander could never win. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon in 324 before Christ, he had crossed continents, crowned himself in 3 languages, and bled kingdoms into memory. But no war, none, left a mark as deep as the one within him. His empire stretched from the Ionian Sea to the edge of India. It was not carved by numbers, it was cut with intent. He was not lucky, he was precise. At Granicus, he challenged the assumption that rivers were barriers. At Issus, he used terrain as a vice. At Gaugamela, he let scale become a weakness. At Tyre, he built a causeway through the sea to make the impossible tactical. Every maneuver wasn't just to defeat an enemy, it was to make sure the next one came trembling. He understood what few generals ever do, that war is not just force, but frame. Control the story, and you control the battlefield before the swords ever cross. And yet, his empire did not outlive him. Within a year of his death, it began to split. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus seized Persia. His generals, once bound by loyalty, turned into kings of their own fiefdoms. Why? Because his brilliance was never institutionalized. It was personal. The strategies were sustainable, the vision was grand, but the empire was held together by one spine. And when that spine cracked, there was no structure left to stand. But here's the paradox. He conquered Persia, but he never escaped the war within himself. He could defeat Darius, burn Persepolis, found Alexandria, march through deserts and across gods, but he could never silence the voices that reminded him he was mortal, that his empire could only march as far as he could breathe. And when that breath ended, in a fevered room with no final battle, no last enemy to face, he left behind more than territory. He left a legacy forged in strategic flame, a map redrawn not just by war, but by thought. So now you've seen it, 5 tactical blades, each one not just a maneuver, but a philosophy. And I ask you, if you held the fate of empires in your grip, would you strike as he did? Or would you hesitate and let the future slip back into the shadows? Let us know. What would you have done? And which of Alexander's tactics cut deepest? The story is over, but the strategy? That still burns. 12 blades, 1 empire. But now it's your turn. Which of Alexander's tactics would you have followed or questioned? Was it fire, deception, terrain, or loyalty that carved his name into eternity? Leave your mark in the comments, and if you're one of us, those who think in strategy, who breathe maps and timelines, then you already know where to go next. Coming up. Constantinople, 1453, the day the medieval world fell. Documentary. A fortress once called invincible, a cannon that changed history, a dawn that ended an age. Subscribe, activate the bell, and join the elite of historical minds because the walls are about to fall. And this time, you're inside them.